Arr! Hello fellow Hunters of the Blue, and welcome to my channel, and also welcome to another episode of Heavy Contrast. Heavy Contrast is a series where I try to paint one miniature to the highest standard possible using just contrast paints and highlights. And for this episode I'm going to paint one of my favorite Warhammer 40k characters of all time, Corsair Prince Yriel, and I chose to paint him in the colors of the new Corsair kill team. Well, because it looks awesome, and second because that way I don't have to make a video for them. So, let's get cracking. As you can see, we're starting from a base coat of grey sear, and I'm going to start by applying Basilicanum Grey over all the parts that will be this lighter greenish blue armor. It doesn't really matter if you catch any other stuff, because we will be cleaning that up later on, but well, if you manage to be clean, better for you. I'm not going to touch anything that will be the black armor, but again, we're going to paint all over them again, so it doesn't really matter. With the Basilicanum Grey now dry, I'm going to apply the second layer over this, and this will be a 1-to-1 mix of Terradon Turquoise and Achillean Green. I'm using a mix because none of them are exactly the same color. This is a very hard to nail down color, but I think this mix gets you pretty close. As you can see, it's a very lovely turquoise color that over that grey just feels perfect. Again, if you want to know how I apply contrast paints, my exact technique to get a smooth finish, you will have a video showing up in the top right corner. With the turquoise armor now base coated, I can base coat the black armor. From this I'm going to start with Mechanicus Standard Grey all over those parts. With two nice layers of Mechanicus Standard Grey now done, I'm going to apply Black Templar all over them. I find Mechanicus Standard Grey the perfect base coat for a solid black armor or any other solid black looks with contrast paint. With all the black parts now base coated, I'm going to start highlighting the armor, and I'm going to start with the turquoise bit first. And for this I'm going to do a chunky edge highlight with a 1-to-1 mix of Salted Green and Saberite Green. Remember that the objective with this edge highlight is to do one edge highlight that you can do a thinner one later on. So if you don't know which is your limit, a very good tip is to do the thinnest edge highlight you can with one pass and then double it with a second pass. That way you know perfectly well that you will be able to do a second one thinner later on. With a chunky edge highlight done, I'm going to move into the thin one. This will be a mix of 1 part Salted Green, 1 part Saberite Green, and 2 parts Gauss Blaster Green. I know this is a complicated mix, but you can just add Gauss Blaster into the previous step, but I prefer to give you a precise mix so you can replicate it as best as possible. And remember to pick up all the edges entirely with this. And with that edge highlight done, I'm going to move into the next one. This is a 1-to-1 mix of Gauss Blaster Green and Baharov Blue. Again, we are moving through this kind of in-between green and blue colors. And here we're just going to pick up the same thin edge highlight, but more concentrated towards edges and corners. In the downward facing edges, I'm just going to do small dots in the very corners here. And for the final highlight, I'm going to use a mix of 1 part Gauss Blaster Green, 1 part Baharov Blue, and 1 part white. As I said before, you can just add white into the previous highlight and it's going to work just fine. So for this, I'm just going to do very small dots in the upper facing corners. With all the black parts now base coated, I'm going to start highlighting them, and for this I'm going to use Thunderhawk Blue and I'm going to do a chunky edge highlight with this. With the Thunderhawk Blue edge highlight done, I'm going to apply the Mini Grey, but only on the armor. I'm not going to apply this on any other parts that are not going to end up being turquoise armor. And this will be our thin edge highlight. And again, as usual, you need to make this as thin as possible and going all around. And for the final highlight before tinting it, I'm going to use Ulthuan Grey. And again, this will be another thin edge highlight, but more concentrated towards the upper edges and corners. As we are going to tint this with another color afterwards, you need to be more aggressive than you may think it's appropriate, because all this will be toned down quite a lot. With that edge highlight finished, I'm going to tint this the appropriate color, and for this I'm going back to my 1-to-1 mix of Achillean Green and Terraton Turquoise, but I'm adding an equal part of medium. This is 1 part Achillean Green, 1 part Terraton Turquoise, and 2 parts Contrast Medium. You might have to adjust this to your liking, maybe a little bit more of medium, but I'm happy with this consistency, and we're going to tint this to create the exact same color as the rest of the armor. You don't want to apply this as a contrast layer, you want to do this as thinly as possible. Basically just a glaze over the surface. Don't be tempted to do this only on the edge highlights, do this all over. The result is going to be better. With that glaze applied, I'm going to now go back to my regular armor highlight colors, and this will be the 1-to-1 mix of Baharov Blue and Gauss Blaster Green. And I'm going to go back to the Ulthuan Grey step basically, but taking a little bit less space. And finally, I'm going back to my last highlight for the armor. This was, if you remember correctly, 1 part Gauss Blaster, 1 part Baharov, and 1 part white. And I'm going to do the final highlight as I did on the rest of the armor. The 2-tone turquoise armor is finished, and I just realized I messed up because his hair is meant to be brown and not black, so forget about that, and we're going to finish the rest of the black details, which in this case is just the spear. And for this I'm going to do a thin edge highlight with Fenrisian Grey. Remember we did previously a thick edge highlight with Thunderhawk Blue. And now for the final highlights on the black details, I'm going to use Ulthuan Grey and just do a little dot highlight. With the black done, I also cleaned up all the areas that are going to be other colors using Corax White, and now I'm going to pre-shade some areas as we did with the armor using Basilicanum Grey. These areas will be all the bits of the red cloth. I will try to be neat, but if I make any mistakes I will just cover them up using Corax White later on. And also the hair. Again, try not to hit any of the face or of the bone white mask that it has. But again, it's easily corrected, so it's not a big deal. The pre-shading is now dry and I'm going to apply the colors over them, and for the hair I'm going to use a mix of 2 parts snakebite leather and 1 part Gergrant fur. And for the red cloth I'm going to use Flesh Tearers Red. And now you really need to be very careful around the armor, because Flesh Tearers Red is very strong, and if you put it all over the armor, it's going to be a mess to clean up. And with all that dry, I'm going to apply the rest of the contrast layers, starting with the leather, and for this I'm going to use a 1-to-1 mix of Gergrant Fur and Basilicanum Grey. I'm basically adding the Basilicanum to desaturate the Gergrant a little bit, because it can be a little bit too saturated. And I may apply a second coat of this over that to get a bit more intensity of the color. I ended up doing a second layer of Gergrant and Basilicanum mix over the leather, and now it's time to paint the face, and for this I'm going to use Guilliman Flesh. With the flesh now base coated, I'm going to finish base coating the details that we're going to finish next by using a 1-to-1 mix of skeleton horde and contrast medium over the parts that we want to be bone color. With those 2 layers applied, I'm going to shade them a bit more using Fire Slayer Flesh in both the bone and the flesh. So I'm just going to apply this Fire Slayer Flesh around the details to, define them better, basically doing a recessed shade. And same goes for the face, where I'm going to catch the eye with this to make it super dark, as well as separating some of the details, for example here around the bone mask, and also some of the face details. With all those layers dried, I'm going to start highlighting the red, and for this I'm going to use a mix of 2 parts Mephiston Red and 1 part Squeak Orange for my chunky edge highlight. And it's time to go back into the thin edge highlight, and for this I'm just going to go for pure Squeak Orange. Again, doing the thinnest line we can, try to be precise and steady with this. If you make any mistakes or you feel like your line is not even and perfect, you can go back to your first chunky edge highlight color and just trim it down till you're happy with it. And now for the final highlight on the red details, I'm going to use Tau Light Ochre. And again, as with the armor, this will be the same thin edge highlight, but more concentrated towards the edges and corners. With the red now done, I'm going to move into the leather, and for this my first highlight will be Deathclaw Brown. And I'm not going to bother here with thin and thick edge highlight, I'm just going to do a thin one to begin with Deathclaw Brown. And for the next and final highlight on the leather, I'm going to use Angor Flesh. Again, same thin edge highlight, but more concentrated towards the upper areas, corners, etc. With all that done, it's now time to paint the face, and for the first highlight I'm going to start with a Screaming Skull. I really like using a Screaming Skull for my highlights on the flesh tones. It really makes them look more natural. I'm just going to glaze some highlights onto the top facing surfaces of the miniature. That highlight done, I'm going to move into the next one. This is a 1-to-1 mix of Screaming Skull and pure white. With that highlight done, I'm going to add tones into our skin so it looks a bit more alive, and for this I'm just going to use Flesh Tears Red. I'm thinning this down a lot with contrast medium, and I'm going to apply this onto parts that see more blood flow naturally, like the cheeks, the ears, nose and lower lip. I'm going to apply as many layers of this as necessary to get the desired look. With those tones now applied, he looks much more alive, but we need to reapply some of the highlights that we have lost during that process. So I'm going back to my both highlight colors and applying them very slightly. So starting with Screaming Skull, and of course the 1-to-1 mix with white. With the face done, it's now time to paint the eyes, well, the eye in this case, and for this I'm just going to base coat it using the 1-to-1 mix of Screaming Skull and white. I never use pure white for my eyes, it just doesn't look natural. Another very good color could be Palette Witch Flesh for this. Now for the pupils I'm just going to use pure black. And now to finish off the eye, I'm just going to take pure white and do a small reflection onto one side of the pupil. With the face finished, time to paint the bone details, and for this I'm going back to my 1-to-1 mix of Screaming Skull and white and just going to do a thin edge highlight with this. And for the final highlights on the bone details, I'm just going to use pure white. And this will be the same thin edge highlight, but more concentrated towards, as always, corners, upward facing surface edges and stuff like that. With the face done, it's now time to paint the hair, and I'm going to start with XV88, and I'm simply going to pick up the ridges of the hair strands. that highlight on, I'm going to move into a 1-to-1 mix of XV88 and a Screaming Skull, and I'm just going to do a thin edge highlight with this. And for the next highlight, I'm going to use a mix of 2 parts Screaming Skull and 1 part XV88. And I will just do the same thin edge highlight, but more concentrated to certain areas to try to simulate the shine of the hair. As you see, I'm picking more or less the same band of highlights in every strand. And finally, I'm just going to pick pure Screaming Skull and do some dots of highlight in the middle of those bands. With all that done, there is basically just a couple of details left to paint, and I'm going to start with all the metallics, and for this I'm going to base coat all the parts that will be gold using a 1-to-1 mix of Retributor Armor and Stormhold Silver, and all the parts that will be steel using Iron Hand Steel. With all the metallic details now base coated, I'm going to shade them, starting with the gold, and for this I'm going to use a 1-to-1 mix of Gergrant Affair and Contrast Medium. And for the steel details, with the exception of the blade, I'm going to use Basilic Cannon Grey. Have something different prepared for the blade later on. With the shading over the metallics done, I'm going to start highlighting them, and I'm going to start with the gold, and for this I'm going back to my base coat of 1 part Retributor Armor and 1 part Stormhold Silver, and I'm just going to do a very simple highlight. And then I'm going to use Stormhold Silver to highlight both the gold and the steel details. With all of that out of the way, there is only just 2 details left to paint, the blade and the gems. And Corsairs use a lot of different colors on their gems, but for this video and for the sake of simplicity I'm just going to do 2, blue and red. And I'm going to start with the blue ones, and for this I'm going to use Achillean green. I'm going to apply my Achillean green from the bottom to the top. And for the red gems I'm going to use Fleshtear's red, and this also includes his visor. Again, ending the brushstroke in the darkest bit. I'm going to do the second layer, but this time I'm going to apply it just to the top and then feather it out. And here on the bigger one I'm going to do a third pass. With all the shading on the gems done, I'm going to start highlighting them, and I'm going to start with the blue ones, and for this I'm going to use Bahar of Blue. And I will just do a simple line at the bottom of the gem. and also a dot at the top. You want the dot that's slightly bigger than what you can do, because we are going to do the smaller one inside next. And for the red gems, I'm going to do the same, but using Wild Rider red. And for the next highlight on the red gems, I'm going to use Luganath orange. And I just want to do the tiniest highlight. And for the blue gems, I'm going to do the same, but with a 1-to-1 mix of white and Baharroth blue. And now to finish all of the gems, I'm going to do 1 dot of white into the corner. Right in the middle of the previous larger dot we did. And just for the blue gems, I'm going to do a small, very small highlight onto the right side. And with all the gems done, it's now time to paint the blade, and I'm going to shade it using Griff Charger Grey in a TMM pattern. I'm going to apply my Griff Charger Grey towards the areas that I want to be darker. You can try to feather this out if you feel like it will have a harsh transition, and I will apply as many layers as I need to get the desired effect. Don't forget to also shade where the blade meets any details. If you want a full explanation of this method, I have a video that will appear in the top right corner. With all the shading done, we just have to highlight it, and for this I'm just going to use a Stonehouse Silver 2H highlight this blade. And with that last step done, Yriel is finished. You can see him here in all of his glory, and eagle-eyed amongst you might see that, well, he's missing quite a big chunk, and that is because I want to make a full dedicated video talking about freehand and also decals and how to turn decals to look like freehand, but I will leave that for next week, where I will finish the 2 banners and the cape and finish Yriel once and for all. So with all of that said, thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye! Do you like my videos and want to help me make them? Well, there are several ways you can do that. You can follow me on social media. You have the links to all my social media in the description below. You can also check all my affiliate links in the pinned comment of this video. Use those links in your next hobby purchase and help me without any additional cost to you. But most importantly, there is Patreon and channel members. You have the link to my Patreon in the description below and in the pinned comment of the video. Or if you prefer it, you can just click the join button below this video. Patreon and channel members help me do all the cool projects that I want to make and help me improve the quality of my videos. Don't be afraid, no content will ever be hidden behind a paywall, but it's a nice way to help me, and you will get something back for your generosity. As I said, guys, thank you very much for watching, and a special thank you to Heather Amster, Nicholas Furnell, Brian Bledsoe, Gringar, LMAP Limited, Tyrannosaur, Carlos Rivera, Chris Goldenthal, Christoph Moret, Gaining Wheat, Javi Mota, Kim Anderson, Michael Boyer, Robert Smith, Thomas Ustergaard, Tom Brand, Victor Domen, Dark Avok, Arundel, Charles Armitage, Chris Fivey, Kieran Umurthail, Chris Talios, Dan Mako, Darcy Ferrar, David Sutherland, Dr. V, Gareth Smith, Geoffrey Dell, G-Force, Green Rollins, Jack Scoten, Jamie Milligan, Jim Kennan, Josh Simpson, JT Butler, Kevin Mian, Kevin Sulas, Donald Lindemann, Liam Clancy, Mark Jarvis, MCJ, Natius Maximus, Nick DeMao, Oscar Jonathan Thomberg, Paul Blunt, Roger Nilsson, Samuel Sasha Park, Stephanie Allantasted for being the coolest persons in the planet. Be like these fine folks on my Patreon and take control.